When I was an undergraduate student at Southern Oregon State College, I took a class titled Space, Time, and the Cosmos that was designed to be a mostly descriptive presentation of the ideas of Albert Einstein's theories of special and general relativity. The main emphasis of the course was on understanding the theories from their most fundamental physical principles without going into the full mathematical treatment. The class used multiple texts, including a somewhat thin volume written by Einstein himself that was titled simply Relativity. The book had originally been written in 1916 and updated a few times afterwards, but it contained the most complete early discussion of the theory that was accessible to the general educated reader, and it had the added relevance that it was written by the author of the theories rather than a later popularizer such as Pauli or Eddington. At the time of my taking the class, I, of course, focused on the content of the book in order to master those things I would be assessed on. But later, as I developed a greater sense of both the scope and interrelatedness of history, I found myself thinking about what it must have been like for Einstein to write that book. There he was, more or less stuck in Berlin, while an all-consuming war raged around him, swallowing an entire generation of men. With this came the discomfort of being disgusted and somewhat estranged from his colleagues because of their nearly jingoistic support for what he viewed as an appallingly senseless act of violence, that of the mechanized battlefield that chewed up human beings in stunningly horrific ways. He would have to endure one colleague that would be basically consumed by a rotting skin disease fostered by the unsanitary conditions that accompanies all conflict, and another colleague who singularly unleashed upon the world the horror of chemical warfare in ever more lethal forms as each year passed. Added to these burdens, his marriage had dissolved as the war began, and he was now dealing with the emotionally wrenching fallout from that, especially as it involved the relationship with his two sons. Accompanying this turmoil was the fact that his mistress was pressuring him to divorce his separated wife and settle down with her into a life of domestic comfort and conformity, a state that both appealed and repelled him in his bourgeois bohemianism. Eventually, it would all combine to take a toll on his health that would force him into a months-long sickbed. And yet, in the words of the slender volume, one detects none of that. Instead, there is the clear and deliberate exposition of the ideas of Galilean relativity and what follows from them. As I think back to my 22-year-old self, working through the pages, trying to understand how there were no preferred reference frames, and what was really important was that the relative velocity between the two observers be understood, it almost seems natural that I would not have thought much of the turmoil in which Einstein was immersed. A turmoil from which he retreated and to a degree insulated himself from by entering into a nearly manic devotion to his scientific work that provided the needed detachment to allow him to keep his equilibrium, at least until the work came to a close. Hello, and welcome to the Scientific Odyssey. The Scientific Odyssey is a mini-part journey into the history and philosophy of science. My name is Chad Davies, and I'm the writer, host, and producer of the podcast, where we consider the ideas, processes, and results of over 2,500 years of scientific inquiry and discovery. Series 3, Finding Our Place. Episode 50.7, Supplemental. Albert Einstein, the best and worst of times. So, to expand on the points I made in the introduction to this episode, when I think of what things must have been like for Einstein in January of 1916, just after his presentation of his general theory to the Prussian Academy of Sciences, I imagine he must have felt like he was riding one of those roller coasters that was so popular in the United States at the time. Back in 1912, he'd accepted a post back in Zurich at his old institution, a move that returned his growing family to the place where everything had sort of begun. He lived there in a large multi-room apartment among a community of friends and colleagues he respected and got along well with. He had risen to the upper echelons of European physics and that community, and his work was moving forward on several fronts. Now, just 3 years later, or a little more, his marriage was all but over, he and Mileva living in a permanent separation that would culminate in divorce and estrangement from his 2 sons. He was embroiled in a tricky affair with his cousin that would eventually be consummated in a second marriage. Yet he had, after a decade of struggle and intense work, finally finished his general theory of relativity and offered a complete and compelling new description of space-time and gravitation. Still, though, he was trapped in a country he didn't much care for in the middle of an all-consuming war that horrified and revolted him. He was largely cut off from the physics community internationally that had so recently accepted him, and that, apart from a few men like Arthur Eddington, had joined in the nationalistic fervor that fed men and material into the seemingly bottomless maw of trenches and artillery pieces. As had been his practice for nearly all of his life, when things had gotten noisy or complicated or difficult in the messiness of daily living, Einstein retreated into his scientific work, the source of both so much joy and isolation, and he had, from that splendid solitude, produced a picture of reality that would, 3 years hence, make him the most famous scientist in all the world. To trace this path, we need to follow 2 threads, one scientific and one personal, as both will factor into Einstein's decisions and personal state during the 6 years where he both transforms humanity's understanding of the cosmos in a way that would catapult him to a status unrealized by any other scientist in human history, and take him to the depths of personal despair he had not to that time known. What I'd like to do in this episode is start with the personal portion of the narrative and then move to the scientific. To do this, we need to spend some time with a topic we've only nibbled at up to this point, and that is Einstein's relationship with women. Now, it's not my intention to dwell on the salacious, nor to spend time reveling in gossip, but I think to understand his decision to move from Zurich to Berlin, it's necessary to spend some time discussing his 2 marriages, both of which, in his own words, he failed at, as well as his seemingly numerous extramarital affairs. As we've already spent a good deal of time discussing the lead-up to his marriage to Mileva, I won't go back over that other than to say that I think it's fair to recognize that Einstein wasn't the greatest relationship partner in that relationship or in a number of others. The question then, one might ask, is why? The answer, I think, has to do with egotism. To put it bluntly, Einstein had a difficult time seeing beyond himself in a relationship that involved something more than the consideration of ideas on an intellectual level. In relationships that revolved around those ideas, as was so often the case with his male friends and colleagues, the focus of the conversation would be content and merit of what was being discussed, and in this arena, Einstein could take what he needed and offer whatever insights he had, often in a light-hearted, humorous, and friendly manner. I expect this is what attracted he and Mileva to each other initially and kept them together until a more intimate connection grew. However, in those relationships where something more was required, it seems pretty clear that Einstein struggled to transition from seeing the relationship in terms of what he got out of it and how it benefited him to something more truly and fully relational. Throughout his life, the series of relationships, both formal and more clandestine, he found himself in really do show that he saw women, at least in emotional terms, in a sense for how he could use them to meet his needs. If this seems to be a bit harsh, remember that, as we discussed in an earlier episode, Einstein, in all of his interactions with others, retained a childlike quality in his thoughts and in his ideas when it came to dealing with almost anything outside of his science. This childlikeness was part of his genius, was the source of much of his rebelliousness when it came to authority, and it colored all of his interactions. We certainly don't blame a child who views his parents or other adult relatives in terms of how they meet his or her needs, and in a sense, Einstein's lingering childlike view of the world explains how he interacted with those with whom he was intimate. Of course, the thing is that we kind of expect children to grow up and to sort of mature and evolve in how they see the world and their relationship to it and to those others who inhabit it. However, as most of us find out sooner or later, not everyone does that for a variety of reasons, and one of those people was Einstein. If he hadn't ever been a world-class theoretical physicist and had instead spent his life as a competent patent clerk with a wife and small family, I don't think anyone would have thought much about his neglect of his wife's needs. Those of us raised with a strong sense of Victorian morals might waggle a finger and look down our noses those times when he might have stepped outside of his marriage for romance after the spark had died, but if we're honest, I don't think we have to look very far around us today to see the same sort of thing going on in nearly every circumstance and profession. If instead, we remove those Victorian morals so strongly centered in Anglo-centric countries, we recognize that Einstein wouldn't have had to and didn't share those same late 19th and early 20th century cultural values, and so his actions would have seemed to him to have been much less objectionable. This is not to say, of course, that he didn't inflict great pain on Mileva as his intentions wandered or that such insensitivity wasn't contemptible in his callousness towards her feelings. However, and this is really an important thing to understand here, Einstein wasn't a run-of-the-mill patent clerk or engineer or something of that sort, and so his marital problems and indiscretions are seen in a different light, one, I think, that's not entirely fair. The issue is, to use his own words written to a colleague after his rise to fame, Einstein became something of a Jewish saint, and we mere mortals like to have our hagiographies, our lives of our saints, pure and unsullied for the most part. It's hard for us to see our heroes, whether they be spiritual, athletic, or in this case intellectual, as regular, flawed human beings in other aspects of their lives. Because of this, there have been for many years, even predating his death, a number of attempts to suppress those aspects deemed by the 20th century British and American cultures to be unsavory. This, of course, leads to a certain sensationalizing of those aspects of his life when they do come out in a way that is often more damaging, due to both them having been hidden and in their lack of true context. So, let's try and understand Einstein from within that context, the context of his life, and see what we can learn. The relationship with Mileva was one that started intellectually, and in time, and in the way of such things very often, the intellectual attraction soon became romantic and then physical. As long as it was the two of them against the world in some sort of bohemian bubble, I think they got along with neither of them believing they really owed each other too much, as such values would have been seen as a product of some sort of a corrupt late 19th century culture or something like that. Of course, as one of my favorite musical artists likes to sing, there is a somewhat different language of the heart, at least in the case of Mileva, and it's clear that as things progressed, something much more binding came about, especially after that Lake Como trip. Just as importantly, though, after their graduation from the Polytechnic, there were other changes in their relationship beyond the level of intimacy and what each expected from the other emotionally. Mileva's failure to pass her finishing exams was likely the first small wedge. The next, much larger one would have been her pregnancy, and Albert stepping away from that in both his stated willingness to support her and this unborn child on the one hand, and his also demonstrated unwillingness to visit either her or their new daughter after the birth. In a story that probably has real resonance in today's world of baby mamas and baby daddies, at least that's what we call them down here in the South, Einstein, once he learned of his girlfriend's pregnancy and his impending fatherhood, seems to have distanced himself from Mileva while proclaiming he'd take seriously his financial obligations. Playing house was one thing, but for him, at least at first, having to set one up was something entirely different. The prospect both set him on the course to gainful employment and also revealed his inability to meet his wife, or at least his lover's needs emotionally. That she gave birth without him there, and that he never met his first daughter, speaks volumes. More importantly, it likely became the first major brick in the wall that would eventually separate the two of them. When, in 1903, Albert got the job at the patent office and the two of them were married, there were more bricks added, some unintentionally, others less so. He would at times spend more time with his friends at the Olympia Academy than with his wife, and much of his time at home was spent working at the desk and one of the scientific pursuits that his wife was slowly and just almost imperceptibly at first becoming less and less a part of. The relationship had begun as a pairing of intellectual equals determined to overthrow the world of physics together. But as time passed, Mileva fell further and further behind her husband, and her dreams of becoming a Serbian Madame Curie grew ever more distant. After the 1905 papers began to bring her husband to the attention of the larger physics community, this disparity was thrown into even starker contrast, something that was very hard for Mileva. In her correspondence to a close friend back in Serbia, she once wrote, "To one goes the pearls, to the other the box." This is not to say that Mileva didn't contribute to what would be a long downward spiral in their marriage. As we've mentioned previously, she could be jealous, spiteful, and even a bit vengeful when she felt slighted. She struggled with lifelong depression and anxiety, and the terms that we might use today about their relationship was likely that she might have been codependent in her relationship with Einstein. She wanted to tie him to her and didn't want to share him with others. He wanted to go out and be part of society, playing and listening to good music, engaging in high-level intellectual conversations, and being a bit of a bon vivant. She wanted small coffee houses with a few friends where she could open up about her feelings and thoughts without fear of judgment or, worse, comparison. While saying that he was an extrovert and she was an introvert would be far too simplistic a way to characterize this dynamic, it does, I think, capture some of what was taking place in their relationship beginning in 1906 and continuing over the next decade. When they went out to visit friends or be part of a salon, he would mingle and talk and leave her to fend for herself, something she would have found very difficult. When they stayed home, rather than engaging her in similar discussions, he would retreat into his work, often in a separate room in his favorite armchair or at a desk piled high with papers she could no longer read or converse with him about. It doesn't take a lot of imagination to realize that the relationship would become strained. A significant break in the marriage came not long after Einstein was hired for his first academic position at the University of Zurich in 1907. On the occasion of his hire, the local papers made mention of it, and an old acquaintance of Einstein's had seen it. Her name was Anna Meyer-Schmidt, and the two had met about a decade earlier in the Italian Alps on one of Einstein's vacation trips with his mother during his time as an undergraduate. While he had found most of the people he met at the hotel with his mother, the hotel that she liked to stay at, dreadfully boring, Anna had captured his imagination, and so he had inscribed in a vacation yearbook she carried along a bit of suggestive doggerel verse that went something like this. "What should I inscribe for you here? I could think of many things, including a kiss on your tiny little mouth. If you're angry about it, do not start to cry. The best punishment is to give me one too." He signed it, "Your rascally friend." Now, I don't know about you, but when I read that, I get a pretty strong impression that the two of them had done a bit more than enjoyed some flirty repartee over various meals some 10 years earlier. They were young adults just coming into their own, and I expect that there may have been a breathless night or two when the older adults were otherwise occupied. Nevertheless, in the intervening decade, both had moved on with their lives, away from the artificial worlds of vacation romances, and, in the way of things, had both gotten married. Nevertheless, when Anna read of Einstein's entry into the world of academics, she penned him a congratulatory note. What's interesting is that he replied, fondly recalling their time together as follows, quote, "I probably cherish the memory of the lovely weeks that I was allowed to spend near you in the Paradies more than you do. So now I've become such a big schoolmaster that my name is even mentioned in the newspapers. But I have remained a simple fellow." End quote. Then he went on to catch her up a bit on his life, mentioning that he was now married to Mileva, but then adding, quote, If you happen to be in Zurich and have time, look me up there. It would give me great pleasure." End quote. Now, again, there are a lot of ways to read this response, but to me, it comes across as being just a bit more flirty than one might think proper, especially for a married man writing to a married woman who was likely something of a summer fling about a decade ago. What's clear is that Anna very much took Einstein's words in that way and wrote back to him picking up on that thread. While we really don't know what was in that letter, what we do know is that Mileva intercepted it and read it and, well, kind of lost her mind. She wrote to Anna's husband, making all sorts of ugly accusations, to which Einstein had to write a follow-up letter begging the man's forgiveness. Quote, "I am very sorry if I have caused you distress by my careless behavior. I answered the congratulatory card your wife sent me on the occasion of my appointment too heartily, and thereby reawakened the old affection we had for each other. But this was not done with impure intentions. The behavior of your wife, for whom I have the greatest respect, was totally honorable. It was wrong of my wife, and excusable only on account of extreme jealousy, to behave, without my knowledge, the way she did." End quote. Now, there's a lot of blame to go around here. In fact, probably on everyone except Anna's poor husband. But it's pretty clear that the entire episode marked a significant turning point in Einstein's marriage. The flirtation probably shattered Mileva's trust in her husband and stoked her jealousy and depression, making her more possessive and controlling. Her intervention, and the fact that he got caught, caused Einstein deep embarrassment and, in his eyes, emasculated him a bit, something that would have aroused his need to both rebel and withdraw. All in all, it was, as the song goes, another brick. While in Zurich, the family managed to work through some of these issues at least well enough to get on and find something of a new equilibrium. But when they moved in 1911 to Prague, things took a significant turn for the worse. Einstein's increasing notoriety in the physics community meant that he began to travel more frequently, leaving Mileva home with their two boys more and more often and for longer stretches of time. Her depression worsened to the point that when one of Einstein's colleagues met her there, he commented that he believed that she might be suffering from schizophrenia, an opinion, Einstein seems to have concurred with. One can sense Einstein retreating into his science, away from the growing darkness at home, by traveling. One of these trips was to Berlin over the Easter of 1912. On this trip, he was reunited with his extended family who had relocated to the German capital over the intervening years following Einstein's father's death. In addition to seeing his mother, he also became reacquainted with his cousin Elsa, whom he had grown up with. Elsa had been married and divorced, and now, at age 36, and with two daughters, shared a home with her parents, Einstein's aunt and uncle. Elsa was everything that Mileva was not. She was cheery, domestic, uncomplicated, and handsome in the traditional German fashion. Einstein, in a place he felt comfortable for the first time in a very long while, and in need of some simple companionship not filled with recriminations, accusations, and intensity, began by flirting with Elsa's sister, but in time turned his attentions to her, attentions she was more than happy to return. When he returned to Prague, he gave Elsa his office address and asked her to continue writing him, and so an affair of letters commenced, this time undiscovered by Mileva. Letters professing each other's love, some with language strikingly similar to that which he had used when writing to his wife some 15 years earlier, shuttled back and forth between Prague and Berlin. This continued for a time until Einstein realized that his marriage at home was truly beginning to unravel, in large part because of his removal of all attention to it. In a pair of letters, he broke off the correspondence with Elsa, saying that they needed to end things. He also recognized that he and Mileva could not stay in Prague much longer. Mileva's health was suffering, and he hated the country and its mix of superiority and submission, as he put it in his correspondence with his close friends. Fortunately, he was able to obtain a post back in Zurich, this time at the Polytechnic, and both he and Mileva hoped that the return to their old haunts would revitalize the intimacy between them. Unfortunately, what was going on, the issues, were really more than things of location. While they were able to move into spacious living accommodations and reunite with old friends and new friends as well, Maleva's depression just continued to get worse. Adding to this, her physical health also began to deteriorate as she developed rheumatism and struggled to find the energy or interest to go out. When she did, she would often sit alone in mental and physical anguish. By the spring of 1913, the situation was ripe for disruption, and that disruption came in the form of a letter from Elsa to Albert. After a year of honoring his request to no longer communicate, she sent a letter for his 34th birthday, and rather than allow it to go unanswered, Einstein replied and told her that he would love to come and visit her in Berlin sometime soon. And with that, the affair was rekindled. And so it was that when, on July 11th of 1913, Planck and Nernst came with their wives to Zurich to make Einstein an offer he couldn't refuse, there were more than just scientific considerations on his mind. For the second track of events that would lead Einstein to take the position in Berlin, we need to head back in time and talk about his work on generalizing the special theory of relativity. As we mentioned in an earlier episode, the special theory only applies to reference frames that are moving at a steady rate or constant velocity with respect to each other. It doesn't apply to cases where a reference frame is speeding up, slowing down, or changing directions with respect to an observer, and it doesn't factor in the phenomenon of gravity. Therefore, over the next decade, Einstein would work in fits and starts to make progress on the topic, only to find his path forward blocked by some obstacle or another time and time again. Now, in his work here, he really had two main goals. The first was to deal with those accelerating reference frames we mentioned just a moment ago, and the second was to address an issue with Newton's universal law of gravitation that had been lingering around the edges of physics for quite some time. In Newton's formulation of gravitation, the mathematical expression suggested that the force was transmitted instantaneously over any distance. This is actually a property of any, what we call an action at a distance force, and how they are formulated mathematically. So to understand this, let's actually consider a thought experiment type of an example. In 1905, when Einstein suggested that the speed of light was not only the same for all observers in all reference frames, he also showed that it was a maximum speed for anything moving through space-time. Now, if we think of the sun, there are two things that it does for us here on Earth in a sense, at least in terms of our thought experiment. The first is that it provides all of the energy in the form of light or electromagnetic radiation that the Earth receives. The second is that it exerts a gravitational force on the Earth that holds the Earth in an almost circular orbit around it. Okay, so far so good. Two things that it does. Now, let's do the thought experiment part of this. Let's say that we had the ability to turn one or the other of those things off. We had like a pair of light switches, except one's a light switch and one's a gravity switch. If we turn off the sun's ability to produce light at its surface, turn off that light switch, it will take about 8 minutes and 20 seconds for us here on Earth to experience darkness due to the fact that the light that's in transit will still be arriving until it stops. This is a result of light's finite speed of travel as described by James Clerk Maxwell's equations, things known as field equations, that describe the propagation of a wave in the electromagnetic field that is what light actually is. Now, let's say we look at the other switch, the gravity switch, and let's say we turn that off. In this case, what would happen according to Newton's universal law of gravitation is that the Earth would immediately stop orbiting the Sun and instead move in a straight line that would be at a right angle to the line between the Earth and the Sun, which is something that would happen according to Newton's first law, which says an object in a state of motion remains in that state of motion. In other words, an object would travel in a straight line with a constant speed if there are no forces acting on it. In this case, if we turn that gravitational switch off, Because of the way the mathematics of Newton's universal law of gravitation is formulated, there would be no delay of 8 minutes and 20 seconds. In fact, if we could do this, what we would actually see according to that mathematical model is that all of the planets would leave their orbits simultaneously, everything from Mercury all the way out to Neptune, if the sun's gravity was turned off. This is a really different result than what we would get with the electromagnetic case, and that's because the mathematics that Newton used to describe gravity wasn't a field theory in the same way as Maxwell had been able to use to describe electromagnetism and light. So this became the second major goal of Einstein's research program, to be able to describe gravitation with a field theory, one in which he hoped that he would be able to show that light changes in gravitational influence would have to propagate through space with a finite speed in a way similar to light. As we can see, this is another instance of Einstein's desire to unify various disparate physical descriptions of nature along the same descriptive lines. The first big jump came with his realization of the equivalence principle while writing a review article in 1907, something we've discussed previously. This was when he recognized that a person sealed up in an elevator that was in freefall wouldn't be able to distinguish between that and a state where he or she was in an elevator in a truly weightless environment. Conversely, if a person was in an elevator suspended in space, and that elevator were pushed or pulled on so that it accelerated at a rate of 9.8 meters per second, the acceleration with which items near the surface of the Earth fall, the person inside the elevator would find that they observed indistinguishable from standing on an elevator at rest on the ground and on the surface of the Earth. This thought experiment, along with a few others that would grow out of it, would become the touchstone for the rest of Einstein's work. He would later say, quote, "I realized that I would be able to extend or generalize the principle of relativity to apply to accelerated systems in addition to those moving at uniform velocity, and in doing so I expected that I would be able to resolve the problem of gravitation at the same time." End quote. Perhaps the most consequential realization that would come out of this thought experiment would be the idea that gravity should be able to bend the path of a beam of light. The way to think of this is to get back into our elevator out there in space somewhere. So we're back in our thought experiment. We're standing on the floor of the elevator. We're out in space. Once again, we're going to attach some sort of a cable to the top of the elevator and pull it with a constant force and cause the elevator to speed up at a constant rate. In other words, we'll pull so that each and every passing second, the elevator will be going 10 meters per second faster than it was in the second before. So that after 1 second, the elevator will be traveling in the direction of the pull at a speed of 10 meters per second. After 2 seconds, we'll be going 20 meters per second, and so on. This will mirror the acceleration of a falling object here at the surface of the Earth, something that we sometimes call the acceleration of gravity. Now, let's say that near the top of the elevator, we have a flashlight mounted so that it will shine a beam of light perpendicular to the wall it's mounted on so that the beam will hit the wall on the opposite side of the elevator. Now, if the elevator isn't moving, the spot of light will hit the wall at exactly the same height opposite the flashlight. Or if you want to think about this with a laser, you can do it that way. But you can sort of think about the idea that we have a little remote control. We hit the button, our flashlight turns on, and the little dot of light on the other wall is at exactly the same height. The second case we might consider would be if the elevator were moving up, or at least in a direction, at a constant speed. In this case, the beam of light would move across the wall at the speed of light as well as upwards with the same speed as that of the elevator when the white light was emitted from the bulb. In this case, the light will still hit the opposite wall at exactly the same height as the flashlight. The third case to consider, though, is that of the elevator speeding up as we described just a moment ago. In this case, the light will be emitted with the same upward speed as the elevator, but now the elevator will speed up as the light travels across that open space of the elevator, but that light beam won't. This means that the elevator will travel just a little bit further upwards than the beam of light, and so the beam will hit the opposite wall at a point that's slightly lower than the flashlight on the other side. The bigger the acceleration, the further down the wall the beam will hit. What Einstein was then able to show was that since the equivalence principle says that an accelerating reference frame will be indistinguishable from an object in gravitational circumstances, the same should happen to a light beam in the presence of gravity. In time, this thought experiment would convince him that gravitation would be best described by the curvature of spacetime, but there'd be a few steps between this idea and that full realization. Another clue that would be important in Einstein's thinking about these ideas would be when he considered what would happen to a spinning disk. According to the ideas of special relativity, the parts of the disk spinning in the direction of motion from the perspective of an observer at rest with respect to the center of the disk would see that the length of the disk in the direction of its motion would be contracted or shortened. This would mean that if the observer tried to relate the circumference of the disk to its diameter, that observer would not measure that relationship to be 3.14159, or what we call pi today, as is the case when you have that disk at rest. This indicated that the rules of Euclidean plane geometry weren't going to be able to be applied to systems in accelerated reference frames, as is the case in the spinning disk. Again, by the equivalence principle, this indicated that any gravitational field theory wasn't going to be able to be modeled by the generalized three-dimensional Euclidean geometries that Maxwell had used to describe electric and magnetic fields. This realization perplexed Einstein tremendously, and so, for a time, he set relativity aside and focused on his work in statistical and quantum mechanics, specifically trying to understand more things about light quanta. While this was taking place, another big step forward during this time was accomplished not by Einstein, but rather by Einstein's former math professor from this time at the Zurich Polytechnic, Hermann Minkowski. Minkowski had read Einstein's paper and had found them profoundly important. Unfortunately, he also found them to be mathematically primitive in many respects. It wasn't that the math was wrong in any way, shape, or form, but rather that it used tools that, while effective, were difficult to work with and that tended to obscure the physical meaning of what was actually taking place. Therefore, in 1907, about the same time Einstein's writing that additional chapter in his review that had the equivalence principle in it, Minkowski reformulated the special theory in terms of a mathematical tool known as tensor analysis that allowed for a much more natural treatment of time as another spatial dimension on equal terms with the three traditional spatial dimensions: length, breadth, and width. In doing this, Minkowski was able to recast Einstein's picture by saying that while there was no absolute space or absolute time, there was an absolute thing known as four-dimensional spacetime. Now, tensor analysis is not exactly a straightforward mathematical tool, especially if one hasn't put in the requisite time to learn things like linear algebra and non-Euclidean geometry. And as we know, Einstein hadn't exactly been the best student when it came to attending his math lectures. This was especially true when it came to geometrical theories that weren't Euclidean, i.e., the geometries of things like planes or cubes. Einstein had shirked his classes on non-Euclidean geometry, probably because he had been so taken as a youth with Euclid's work. Thus, when Minkowski's papers came out, while the broader physics community welcomed them as important developments, Einstein himself was not exactly a fan. He would complain to a colleague, in fact, that he was considering setting aside all of his work on relativity on account of the mathematicians having taken it over and rendered it sort of a theoretical concept divorced, as he saw it, of physical meaning. However, when his progress on generalizing the theory of relativity stalled after about 1907, he eventually came to recognize that he needed to embrace Minkowski's way if he were to have any hope of making additional progress. By 1911, he had reached a point where he had hit something of a wall with his work on quantum mechanics, and so he decided to once again take a look at relativity. In writing to his old friend Michele Besso, he mentioned that he wanted to take the topic up again, and so he wrote a more detailed calculation of his light-bending thought experiment for a paper he submitted to Annalen der Physik, wherein he calculated the amount he thought the sun would deflect the light of a star as it passed near it, a quantity that turned out to be about 0.86 arc seconds. This calculation, however, and this is an important thing to remember, was based on a formulation of gravity rooted in Newtonian ideas rather than in relativistic ones. And as he began to work his way back into his notes, he realized that he needed a better way to deal with curvature and geometries that were not Euclidean. So it was that during his second stint in Zurich, he would meet with his old friend Marcel Grossmann to learn those techniques. Now, since their graduation from the Polytechnic, Grossmann had followed a much more traditional academic path. He first worked as a teacher at a gymnasium while finishing up his PhD in mathematics. A PhD, by the way, which showed that he had specialized in non-Euclidean geometry. And then he had taken a series of increasingly important university positions before ending back up in Zurich as the chair of the math department there. When Einstein returned to the Polytechnic there in Zurich himself, he sent word to Grossmann that he needed help, writing, quote, "Grossmann, you've got to help me or I'll go crazy," end quote. Intrigued by this possible application of his mathematical specialty to a physical application, Grossmann immediately jumped in. This development marks an important turning point in Einstein's way of doing physics, and perhaps in the way of doing theoretical physics in general. Up until 1912, Einstein had not really needed a strong background in mathematics because his discoveries had come from his insights into how to think about the physical world in new ways. He had learned how to question underlying assumptions that had been made by those who had come before him, and in doing so, he had seen new paths of inquiry. With relativity, however, the need to think in terms of curved geometries was, in a sense, too difficult to do just by considering various thought experiments. There was now a need for mathematics to take a guiding role where the equations and their manipulations would offer insight into physical reality. As he would write to Arnold Sommerfeld, quote, "I am now working exclusively on the gravitation problem, and I believe that, with the help of a mathematician friend here, I will overcome all difficulties. I have gained enormous respect for mathematics, whose more subtle parts I had considered until now, in my ignorance, as pure luxury." End quote. The mathematics needed was something that would allow Einstein to treat Minkowski's four-dimensional spacetime in a way that would allow it to have curvature. The best analogy to this is to think of two-dimensional space and what happens when you curve it. In flat two-dimensional space, you can use the geometry of Euclid and you can do that to come up with how to find, say, the distance between 2 points in a plane. If you've studied a little Euclidean geometry, you know that the shortest distance between those 2 points is going to be a straight line, and there are several different ways one can go about determining the distance of that line. Some from Euclid's work, and then others from, say, later mathematicians such as Descartes. Now let's say you take that two-dimensional surface and you curve it. One way you might curve it would be similar to taking a piece of paper and bending it so that it forms a tube along its long axis. Now, if you do that, you've curved the two-dimensional surface, and now your mathematics for determining the shortest distance between the 2 points is going to change. First, that distance might not be a straight line. And in fact, it won't be a straight line if you were actually to bend that two-dimensional surface into the shape of a globe. And then secondly, the mathematics that you once used for the flat plane won't work anymore, and so you've got to develop a new kind of mathematics. So what Grossmann and Einstein had to do, and here it was pretty much Grossmann's work initially, was to find a new type of geometry that would allow them to deal with 4 dimensions that were both connected and curved. After some research, Grossmann came to the conclusion that the framework that had been developed by the German mathematician Bernhard Riemann would be the best one to work with. Riemann had developed a non-Euclidean geometrical approach that could be used with any number of dimensions and that could calculate the shortest path and distance between any 2 points in a curved quote-unquote in-space, as it is called, using something known as a metric that, basically used that same tensor mathematics Minkowski had employed with special relativity. This framework would form the basis of Einstein's attempts over the next 3 years to come up with a theory of general relativity. It would allow him to fully realize his insight that gravitation was geometry, albeit a curved geometry, and that it was, in essence, not a force in the traditional sense, but rather a result of 4-dimensional spacetime being curved, and that curvature telling objects how to move. Beginning in the summer of 1912, Einstein would begin working with the mathematics of Riemann, as well as extensions developed by the Italian mathematicians Gregorio Ricci Curbastro and Tullio Levi Cavita, recording his work in something now known as the Zurich Notebook. In this collection of notes, it can be seen that Einstein took a sort of two-track approach. With one track, something he called his physical strategy, he continued to try to use his physical insights to guide his work, while on the other, mathematical strategy, he followed the equations to see where they might take him. What's clear is that Einstein hoped that his discoveries on each path of inquiry would help illuminate avenues of further investigation on the other, not unlike the method Arthur Eddington was using in his astrophysical work at the time in England on developing models of stars. By the end of 1912, Einstein had come up with a set of equations that would describe a field equation using a tensor that actually turned out to be pretty close to the answer he would eventually arrive at in 1915. Unfortunately, due to a couple of mathematical errors that went uncaught, it didn't seem to meet a couple of criteria that Einstein correctly thought physically necessary, and so he discarded his mathematical strategy and switched almost exclusively to the physical one. So it was that in 1913, he and Grossman embarked on a new course that resulted in something known as the Outline of a Generalized Theory of Relativity and of a Theory of Gravitation. They actually submitted this as a paper that sort of set out the guidelines and boundaries that they thought a theory should have and sketched out a research program. Another way to look at it was that they were struggling and really hoped that by publishing a paper that someone else could provide a crucial insight that would get them unstuck. It also put into words a plan of attack that they both could follow as they corresponded, something that would become important once Planck and Nernst showed up in Zurich with their offer to bring Einstein to Berlin. For a time, the outline, or Entwurf in German, really pleased Einstein as he believed he was just a few steps from wrapping the whole thing up. In June of 1913, he and Michele Besso sat down and worked from it, producing some 50 pages of calculations built on its foundation, including an initial attempt to determine the unaccounted-for precession of Mercury's orbit that we discussed way back in our episode on relativity, 3.42. The other problem they considered was one that went all the way back to Isaac Newton, actually, one that we actually discussed in those episodes so long ago on his life. And it's a problem known as the spinning bucket problem. Newton had used the fact that when you spin a bucket with water in it, the water will eventually rotate in such a way that the water will sort of climb up the walls of the bucket a little bit, forming a concave surface. If the bucket's rotation were then to be suddenly stopped, the water would continue to rotate with the associated concavity to the surface until the friction with the walls of the buckets brought the water's rotation to a rest. Now, Newton had used this as a proof of there actually being an absolute space. And as we've talked about already, this was something that Einstein had abolished with his special theory. So what he and Besso did is they took the outlined form of the generalized theory and they used it to make an argument that the concavity of the spinning water surface was not in fact due to the water's motion with respect to an absolute frame of reference, but rather it was due to that water's motion with respect to all other matter in the universe. A result, by the way, that he sent to Ernst Mach, sort of to kind of show that, Mach had been right all along to question Newton's, faith in an absolute set of systems. Unfortunately, though, in their calculations, they again made some errors, specifically with respect to the metric having to do with the rotation of the water. Besso would catch these about a month or so later, but Einstein dismissed his comments, likely too caught up with the preparations for his impending move to Berlin and his reignited affair with Elsa, to give them the consideration it deserved, something he would soon come to regret. And so, to bring everything together, let's do a little dating of events to get things into perspective. As our anchor, let's put a thumbtack in at July 11th, 1913, when Planck and Nernst, along with their wives, climb off the train at the Zurich rail station to offer Albert Einstein a place in the Prussian Academy of Science, a full professorship at the University of Berlin with no teaching duties, and his own physics institute with actually very few administrative responsibilities. For about a year up to that point, Einstein had been making some really significant progress on generalizing his theory of relativity, something that hadn't quite been published yet, and he felt confident that it was only a short time before he'd wrap all of that up in a tidy little bow. On the personal front, though, his marriage with Mileva, as we said, was really in a death spiral at this point. While he wanted to keep his family together, especially so that he could be a part of the lives of his two boys, he no longer took any sort of joy in his relationship with the woman he'd once hoped to live a gypsy life with. His heart was now with his cousin in Berlin, and he was looking for ways he could take her as his mistress. From their point of view, Planck and Nernst were hoping that they could get Einstein to come to Berlin and increase the university's prestige by making it the preeminent place to do theoretical physics. They thought that he would come and continue his work on light quanta and statistical mechanics, not knowing that he was a long ways down that relativity rabbit hole. Nor did they know that in Copenhagen, Niels Bohr was about to upend the apple cart when it came to quantum mechanics by extending the work being done by experimentalists at Cambridge and Manchester. Moreover, on top of all of that, no one saw that Europe was teetering on a political precipice over which it was about to tumble. So why did Einstein take the position in Berlin, given his well-documented aversion to Germanic sensibilities rooted in regimentation and militarism? As we've discussed, he disliked Germany and had actually given up his citizenship 2 decades earlier, which, by the way, he'd have to take back up to become a member of the Prussian Academy. His time with Joss Wendler and his exposure to the ideas of internationalism and socialism had led him to reject the very nationalism and jingoism that were sweeping much of Europe during this time. So why leave Switzerland, sort of a safe haven from all of that, to go to Berlin? The answer depends on which letters to whom you actually read. To Aaron Fest, Einstein wrote that he was tired of his teaching responsibilities, meaning really he was tired of his lecturing duties, and the fact that they were getting in the way of his research, which really is a sign that he was really struggling to work out the unexpectedly difficult details of the Entwurf, or outline. To Lorentz, in the Netherlands, he was more serious, and he noted that the position would allow him to focus more deeply on his research both in relativity and in light quanta. However, to his personal confidants and to Elsa, he made it clear that he was going to Berlin to be with her. In other words, in his mind, his romantic relationship with Mileva was over, and he was looking forward to making, things physical with Elsa that, had up to that point only really been expressed in writing. What seems clear to me is that when Einstein decided to take the job in Berlin, it was likely the thing that would be the beginning of the end of his marriage in sort of the final stages of that. In fact, as much as he despised German ways and mannerism, his wife, Mileva, hated them even more. As Walter Isaacson adroitly puts it in his biography of Einstein, she shared the well-acquired Slavic revulsion for all things Teutonic. For her, moving to Berlin was a disaster even more acutely felt than moving to Prague had been. Not only was she having to leave behind Zurich, which she claimed to love, but she would also be now surrounded by the customs she despised, and perhaps worse, in almost daily contact with Einstein's mother, who had made no secret over the years her ongoing disapproval of Mileva. In other words, from March's perspective, she was walking into the gladiator's arena to face the lion without so much as a shield with which to protect herself. Einstein, for his part, tried to put a brave face on things by taking his family on a long summer vacation in the Alps, along with Marie Curie and her daughters. But the interactions between the two physicists likely just threw into greater relief what could have been versus what actually was for the Einsteins, especially for Mileva. After this, the family traveled to visit Maleva's family in Novi Sad, where she took the occasion to have the boys baptized as Orthodox Christians, something that Einstein claimed to care very little about in a letter to a friend that was written in a way that makes it pretty clear that he was pretty aggravated that he hadn't been consulted in the slightest about the decision. As a result, when they returned to Zurich, Einstein embarked on another set of travels to various conferences that included a rather long stop in Berlin, where he and Elsa likely consummated their affair. In his letter to Elsa during this time, there's a marked difference in his letters to her than the ones that he had sent to Maleva at about the same stage in his courtship with her. Einstein and Elsa at this point began writing to each other about creature comforts of life. Things like good food and comfortable furniture. The importance of Albert maintaining good grooming habits, as opposed to ideas in physics and philosophy and, what Helmholtz had written recently or the discoveries of Hertz or any of the sorts of things that you saw in the letters between Albert and Maleva. For Einstein, his relationship with his cousin wasn't going to be a meeting of two minds, but rather one of domestic union. They were destined, after the initial fires of passion wore off, to be really, the best way to say it is to say they were domestic companions and very little more. Elsa would never be interested in her partner's work, but rather in, she found the fame and notoriety that being associated with a brilliant mind would bring the things that were very attractive. For Albert, the prospect of having someone who could cook his favorite meals and leave him undisturbed when he wanted to work was something he found very deeply appealing, at least for a time. The final break in the marriage seems to have taken place during the late spring or early summer of 1914. Now, Maleva had gone to Berlin over that preceding Christmas holiday, right at the end of 1913, and had gotten the family a large apartment. And when it came time to move during that following early spring, the couple's youngest son, Edward, had come down with an ear infection that required Maleva and Edward to stay in Zurich so that, Edward could be seen at a nearby alpine resort. Einstein, however, had traveled to Berlin and once again took up his affair with Elsa, who was now beginning to press him to divorce his wife in order to marry her. When Maleva arrived in April, neither of them were in a place to be emotionally accommodating of the other's stresses. Albert was struggling to settle into his new roles, as well as getting things to work with relativity, while Maleva was depressed due to having to leave Zurich. In no small part, by the way, due to having had, left an affair of her own that had developed in the waning days of her time in Zurich while Albert had been away. While we don't know what the final catalyst for the breakup actually was, Maleva moved out of the apartments in early June after what may have been a fairly traumatic event of some sort. She moved the family in with the only one other person she actually knew, a chemist by the name of Fritz Haber, whose own institute was housing Einstein's, and thus he and his wife were the only couple that she actually knew. The Habers tried to mediate, the discord, but for Albert, this last blow-up really had been the last straw. In mid-July, he delivered an ultimatum to Maleva that is just stunning in its coldness. While I won't go into full detail here about it, those who are interested can find the missive that he sent and the terms of their reunification, if you want to call it that, in almost any modern biography of Einstein. But what can be said is that its content makes it completely clear that Einstein is only willing to continue to have any kind of relationship with his wife on completely business-like terms, and only then for the sake of their sons. In short, the ultimatum reads more or less that they can continue to live together only if she more or less agrees to be his maid. And that's really harsh. It was with the receipt of this list of demands that Maleva finally realized that the relationship was irrevocably broken. In short term, she and Albert agreed to do what was basically legal separation, where she would return with his children to Zurich. The entire thing was tremendously painful to Einstein, even given his own role in how things played out. And, when he moved out of the apartments for a time into the home of Elsa's parents while she was actually away on vacation, he would write to her of his pain while actually sleeping in her bed. When he went to see his wife and children off for their return to Zurich to take up a life without him on July 19th, he would be accompanied by Fritz Haber, who said that he quote-unquote bawled like a little boy. However, before long, as had always been the case when the tides of emotional turmoil threatened his equilibrium, Einstein dove back into his scientific work as a refuge from the, as he put it, merely personal. Probably the foremost thing on his mind at this time was a project he'd been toying around with since he first worked out the amount he believed the light from a star should be deflected as it passed near the sun. When he had published the paper in 1911 in Annalen der Physik, it had been read by a young astronomer looking to make a name for himself called Erwin Finlay Freundlich. Freundlich had reached out to Einstein, expressing his desire to test the hypothesis, and the two men began trying to plan a way to make the trip to an eclipse site possible. At one point, Einstein even offered to pay for a portion of the expenses himself to fund the trip. However, when he was hired to go to Berlin, one of the things he had tried to get written into the contract there was some funding for the project for Freundlich to go observe an eclipse to see if he could measure the bending of starlight. As it would turn out, while some of the money was provided through the university, most of it was put up by private donors, the lion's share of which was actually put forward by the Krupp Foundation. The plan was for Freundlich and a team to travel to the Crimea region of the Russian Empire on the Black Sea to make observations of the August 21st eclipse there. However, as they made their way to the observing location, a war broke out. Actually, the Great War broke out. As many of you no doubt know, as Einstein and Mileva were separating from each other, the Serbian nationalist Gavrilo Princip assassinated the heir to the Habsburg throne of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, an event that set off a chain of events that would lead to the most destructive and tragic conflict Europe would know up to that date. As Einstein's marriage disintegrated and he retreated into both the arms of Elsa and the abstract certainties of relativity theory, Europe's diplomatic apparatus failed to head off the war that had been brewing for nearly a decade, and on or about August 1st, the armies of the great powers of Europe mobilized. Freundlich and his team, whose cameras and telescopes looked a lot like espionage equipment to the Russians, were arrested and detained. For Einstein, the calamity of this event that put a young scientist who was, in essence, working for him, snapped him back into reality. He worried greatly that his young colleague would come to harm, though, in a prisoner exchange between the two nations, Freundlich would be returned safe and sound. More importantly, however, the war created in Einstein an enormous crisis. He had been lured to a Germany he disliked with the promise of being able to do science peacefully and free of interference. Now, the German people, with all of the military fervor and nationalistic rhetoric that could be mustered, marched off to war, invading neutral Belgium in the process and making a mockery of any pretense of respecting its diplomatic agreements. When much of the world protested this action, the various parts of German society mounted a defense of this breach of the rules of civilized diplomatic conduct. Among those who did so were a group of scientists including Einstein's colleagues Nernst, Haber, and most disappointingly for Einstein, Planck. These members of the University of Berlin would join 90 other academics in publishing a profoundly nationalistic document titled Appeal to the Cultured World, but that has become known in historical terms as the Manifesto of the 93. In it, they disputed the reports of German atrocities in Belgium and argued that Germany was justified in its actions on the grounds that it was protecting Teutonic culture from certain destruction by the French and Russians, and thus any actions it might have taken were actually, in fact, excusable on those grounds. For Einstein, this was a step too far, and he refused to have anything to do with the document, something that threatened his standing among his colleagues. In fact, he would engage with a smaller group of German intellectuals who called for a cessation of hostilities and a return to diplomatic means for resolving the differences. In the Manifesto to the Europeans, as it is called, the group would reject the arguments of the 93 scientists and would call for Germany to recognize its transgressions, I should say. As a result of both the environment and the document's strong language that blamed all parties equally, they had a difficult time getting people in Germany, scientists or anyone else for that matter, to add their name or even to get the document officially published inside the country. In part because people were afraid that if it got published, the people whose names were put on it would be in real physical danger. Nevertheless, versions of the manifesto did make it out into the broader European community, including to men like Eddington, who shared Einstein's pacifist views and who would look to scientific work and collaboration as a way to begin healing the deep wounds the catastrophic war would inflict. This would bear fruit in 1919, something we'll talk about in our next episode. Now, as this isn't a podcast on the Great War, though there are some excellent shows out there for those who are interested, I won't spend too much more time on the details of the conflict, and instead will return now to Einstein's work on general relativity, as this proved to be a refuge for him as the war drug on in its initial years. Throughout 1914, Einstein had struggled to use the Entwolf to guide his research, and kept finding that it didn't quite measure up when applied to complex test cases. As 1914 turned into 1915, and the quick war everyone had been promised transitioned into the grinding trench warfare that would consume a generation, Einstein began to realize that there were very real problems with the entire thing, especially when he tried to calculate the precession of Mercury's orbit again and came up with a number that was too small for what had been observed. Nevertheless, in June of 1915, he went to the University of Göttingen to deliver a series of lectures on the work, and in doing so came into a collegial relationship with the brilliant German mathematician David Hilbert. While the lectures were an enormous success in that they generated a great deal of enthusiasm, they also revealed for all to see what the problems in the theory were. Hilbert decided that Einstein's physical approach was holding him back, and so committed himself to follow a completely mathematical strategy to sort out the issues and, in a sense, scoop Einstein. Back in Berlin, Einstein was unaware of this for a time, but in October he was confronted with the reality that the issue with the rotation matrix Besso had brought up a year or more ago wasn't actually going away. This was really a fatal blow to the outline, and it forced Einstein to re-examine everything. At about the same time, he also became aware that Hilbert was now deeply engaged in the same project he was and was making more progress. Now, Einstein was known for his ability to stick with an unpopular or unproductive idea for long enough to see it through whatever difficulties might come up. In a sense, this was really a part of his rebelliousness in some ways, and it actually resulted in a lot of his great discoveries. But he wasn't so stubborn that he would hold on to an idea that was clearly inadequate. And so it was that in October that he completely abandoned the Entwolf and went back to that 1912 Zurich notebook. What he found there was that the original mathematical path actually did solve some of the problems he was having once he found a few of the math errors he and Grossman had made. This unlocked the door towards a solution and sent him down the final path that would result in that full solution. In this, and this is sort of an aside, I've read some commentators who have concluded from this whole discussion that the Entwolf outline was really just a 2-year blind alley that turned out to be a waste of time. But I don't think this viewpoint really takes into account just how science is sometimes done. Yes, looking back, one can trace a pathway from the Zurich notebook's mathematical strategy to the final theory, but that ignores the truth that during that period, Einstein was stumbling around in the dark, as it were. He didn't know what would and wouldn't work, which pathways would result in the best progress. Moreover, he was actually still trying to get a full handle on the problem. It's easy in hindsight to see that the mathematical strategy was really the best way to proceed, but Einstein didn't have the luxury of that perspective. From what I've read and seen in my survey of the history of science, I think that without the Entwolf work, he may not have had the necessary physical insight to evaluate his mathematical models and may never have been able to make the enormous progress that would come in that period between October to December of 1915. He had to fight through that thicket of inadequate ideas to get a true picture of the problem and how to best solve it. Nevertheless, once he realized that the best path forward was through the mathematics, he was able to focus himself and all of his energy in a Herculean effort to pull everything together. Certainly his excitement at the insights that he was finally getting propelled him forward, but so too did his competition with Hilbert, I think. This was his theory, and these were his ideas. And there was no way he was going to allow some Hilbert come lately to take the baton in the last few months of a decade-long effort and cross the finish line first. By the end of November, after about 4 weeks of near total devotion, he finally had the theory in a form that he could present to the Prussian Academy of Sciences. Over the course of 4 lectures, some of which, by the way, he was writing at the last minute between the once-weekly sessions so that he could incorporate new results he was still deriving, Einstein put forward his general theory. As he was doing this, Hilbert too was rushing his results to the publisher. The two men would complete their work nearly neck and neck, close enough that there's actually a somewhat spirited historical debate as to who actually got the work done first and who deserves credit for publishing the theory. While there would be a good bit of tension between the two men in the few months between December of 1915 and March of 1916, Hilbert would eventually acknowledge that he contributed very little new creative work to the efforts. Mostly what he did is he cleaned up the mathematics, and that he really admitted that the key ideas were all Einstein's. The two men would patch up their differences through personal correspondence and would return to a relationship of warm collegiality, as was so often the case with those with whom Einstein collaborated, at least in intellectual terms. On personal relationships, well, that was sometimes a different thing. Unfortunately, while his success in the area of relativity was heralded by his colleagues, his personal life was not nearly so rosy. Once a separation agreement had been reached, Mileva returned to Zurich with Einstein's children. Over the course of the next few years, there would be a number of attempts for Einstein to spend time with his children, some successful, some less so. For a time, actually, especially later on, Einstein would even consider returning to a joint position at the University of Zurich and the Polytechnic to be closer to his sons, but was talked out of it by those who correctly reasoned that doing so would only open old wounds and continue a cycle of unrealistic hopes and the disappointment and recriminations that would have inevitably accompany their being dashed on the bitter rocks of reality. The best way to think of Einstein's interaction with Mileva and his two boys during the years between 1914 and 1919 could be filed under the heading of Divorce Stinks, not to be too forward about the whole thing. To give a sense of this, allow me to share a personal recollection. When I was in high school in the early 80s, divorce rates in the United States were beginning their significant climb to higher percentages, and I remember a number of my classmates and friends having to deal with the fallout of all of that. Society back then didn't have very good ways of helping dissolving couples process the emotions and tensions created by divorce, much less help the children of those families that were unraveling process their own sense of being abandoned. Much of the angst of Generation X comes from the fact that the children of those divorces felt abandoned at best or used and manipulated by parents as a tool to hurt the other spouse in the worst cases. Something, by the way, that I saw frequently with my friends. It would take a generation before culture caught up with the trend of more divorces and developed the tools to help those caught in the conflict work through it in ways that minimize the damage to all involved. In the meantime, there was a lot of emotional suffering and a lot of hurt that I saw done in the lives of many of my friends, and to hear their stories, their parents as well. For Albert and Mileva, along with the two children, the events between 1915 and 1919 were pretty awful for all the same reasons, but in even greater intensity and consequence. Einstein would accuse Mileva of poisoning the children against him and try to get them to move to be with him in Berlin. Mileva would try to protect her children from the perceived licentiousness in Einstein's life and would worry herself until her health collapsed. Einstein's oldest son, Hans Albert, would reach out to his father and then retract his attempts to form some sort of relationship. Einstein would promise to travel to meet his sons only to get cold feet and back out. Friends would struggle with taking sides, often making the conflict worse. And the list goes on and on and on. And those who have been through divorces probably in the list see a lot of similarities to what anyone goes through. Eventually, Einstein would find a way to normalize a relationship with his oldest boy, Hans Albert, and even come to a state of détente, if such a term might be used, with Mileva. But the road would be a long and rocky one. As a result of his overwork and familial stress, Einstein was struck with a stomach ailment in 1917 that made it nearly impossible for him to eat, and then, very soon, confined him to a bed for months. While I've not been able to find a definitive diagnosis for his ailment, it seems to me that the stress of dealing with his family issues, the pressure being put on him by Elsa for him to formally divorce Mileva, and the increasingly worsening situation in Germany as the war dragged on through its second year and the British blockade of goods flowing into Germany began to really bite, all combined to create a perfect storm of disillusionment for Einstein that was made worse by shortages of good, healthy food. Eventually, Elsa, who had been maintaining a completely separate household from that of her lover, dropped most of the pretenses about their relationship and just rented an apartment in the same building that Albert was living in so that she could take care of him. From that point, she took over his health care, and within a few months his condition improved, though by then he had lost over 50 pounds and was pretty weak and unsteady. This decline was mirrored in Mileva, who suffered a series of minor heart attacks, it is thought, that first confined her to a bed and then eventually sent her to a sanitarium. She entered a spiral of depression and anxiety that threatened to end her life. So it was that in 1918, the year that the Great War entered what would be its final, spasms, if you want to call them that, with the combatants being exhausted and running low on supplies and morale and resources and all the rest, Einstein and Marich realized too that they needed to bring their marriage to an end so that they could both move on and get well. In the final settlement, Einstein promised Mileva the monetary prize from the eventual Nobel Prize he was now sure to win, as well as a monthly stipend, and he was freed to marry Elsa, something he would do in early 1919 as Germany and the new Weimar Republic struggled to find its footing as communist revolution roiled the country. It would be in those days, at the end of the Great War, that Einstein would take his first political actions, at least, really big, outwardly obvious political actions. In the early days of November 1918, the students of the University of Berlin, inspired by a workers' revolt up in Kiel, rose up in communist solidarity and arrested the institution's rector and deans. Einstein, along with his colleague Max Born and the psychologist Max Wertheimer, went down to the place where the students were meeting as a communist Soviet, or ruling committee, to see if they could get the men released before anything violent happened to them. When they arrived, the student Soviet, after making them wait a bit, presented them with a draft document and asked their opinion of its proposed new rules of university governance. After considering what he had been presented, Einstein told the students, quote, "I have always thought that the German university's most valuable institution is academic freedom, whereby lecturers are in no way told what to teach, and the students are able to choose what lectures to attend, without much supervision and control. Your new statutes seem to abolish all of this. I would be very sorry if the old freedoms were to come to an end." End quote. Max Born would later recall that the students' response was one of confusion, not having expected a man known for his socialist leanings to stand against them. As he wrote, quote, "The high and mighty young gentleman sat in perplexed silence." End quote. In this, we see the first real outward manifestation of the political theory Einstein had learned while living with Jost Windler in Aarau. He was a socialist, yes, but a democratic one with no interest in having any truck with the autocracy found in the writings of Lenin. In other words, Einstein fully rejected communism. His response to the Student Soviet, of course, did very little to help the cause of freeing the university's leaders, but its frankness did open enough of a window that the students told the three professors that they should go to the local authorities, as they, the students, didn't have the authority to release those who had been arrested. Thus, Einstein and his colleagues went down to the Reich Chancellor's palace, and after some finagling, managed to get the men released before any harm came to them. Something, by the way, that didn't happen in a lot of other places in Germany during this period. The three then went to a public gathering where Einstein read from a prepared 2-page speech imploring his fellow Berliners not to go down the path of communist autocracy. He said, quote, "All true Democrats must stand guard lest the old class tyranny of the right be replaced by a new class tyranny of the left. Do not be seduced by feelings that a dictatorship of the proletariat is temporarily needed in order to hammer out the concept of freedom into the heads of our fellow countrymen." End quote. And this was really his plea before calling for open and fair elections available to all. Something he thought was possible for his, German countrymen to sort of embrace immediately. A little over a decade afterwards, as Adolf Hitler and the Nazis came to power, he would ruefully recall his belief that he could, by mere words, remake Germany's culture. To Max Born he would write, quote, "Do you still remember the occasion some 25 years ago when we went together to the Reichstag building, convinced that we could turn the people there into honest Democrats? How naive were we for men of 40? End quote. As we reach the end of the Great War, so too must we reach the end of this episode. While there is more to say of the years immediately preceding the armistice, of the 11th hour, of the 11th day, of the 11th month, it is better that we fold that part of the narrative into what comes after, the experimental proof of the predictions of the general theory and Einstein's resulting rise to fame. As I release the show, I'm in the middle of finals week, and so I hope to soon return to a much more regular release schedule as I transition into the slower rhythms of a summer devoted to writing and reworking curriculum. It's been a long semester for me, and I'm very much looking forward to once again immersing myself into the topics of history and philosophy of science to bring you episodes on a weekly basis. As a shout out this week, I would like to mention this year's Train Like a Martian Challenge that will take place on May 14th through the 18th. If you're interested in knowing more about the event, you can go to www.themarsgeneration.org/train-like-a-Martian, and it's train-like-a-Martian, and find out more about the whole thing. I think it's a really wonderful way to learn about the most recent efforts to make a way for humans to travel to that world most like our own in the solar system, and to sort of turn that into educational curriculum if that's something you're interested in doing. Also, in that vein, we here at the Scientific Odyssey want to congratulate NASA on the recent launch of the next mission to the Red Planet, the Mars InSight mission. I think it's going to be a really cool whole, set of missions with some really great mission objectives, and I look forward to seeing the science that comes out of that. If you'd like to engage with us here at the Scientific Odyssey and what we're doing here at World Headquarters, you can join our Facebook group. Follow me on Twitter at @ChadDavies, or send me an email at cldavies@mac.com. We'd really love to hear from you, and if you've got some adventures you want to share with us, we'll be happy to post them out there at one of those sites. Also, I'd like to give a thanks to those who have taken the time to leave us a review over the last few weeks. We really appreciate that you took the time to let others know what you think of what we're doing here. Next time, we'll be back with a discussion of Einstein's rise to worldwide fame and what he did with that. Until then, full sails on your journey.